Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we're back with another episode of Cheap Shots. This series shows you money-saving tips that you can use in your own wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, we're going to show you guys how to quickly and cheaply paint up Kill Team Imperial Navy Breachers for Games Workshop's Warhammer 40,000 Kill Team. As you can see in this photo, this is the end result that you'll have. You'll have a beautiful tabletop standard, and by following the suggestion for the materials and techniques that we suggest in this video, you can actually paint up this entire kill team for $29.42. Now, when you compare that with the materials you'll need to purchase from Games Workshop's Citadel line, as well as Army Painter, you're talking about a grand total savings of $157.38. So that being said, let's go on and talk about how to paint up Kill Team Imperial Navy Breachers quickly and, more importantly, cheaply. So first off, the thing you need to do, of course, is to fully assemble as well as texture and prime your miniatures. So as you can see in this photo, I have fully assembled my entire kill team to the standard that I wanted to be at. And the next thing, of course, I did is I textured the bases. Now, what I did for my texturing is really simple. All I did is I just painted my bases with some cheap wood glue that I had lying around the house, and then once I just dusted with some sand that I got from my backyard garden and let it dry. Once it was dried, I made a slurry, making a 50-50 combination of both wood glue as well as with water, and then I applied it like a wash over the texturing, so that way when it dried, it created an airtight seal in order to create that texturing on the bases. Now, of course, you could use Games Workshop's Astrogranite if you want to do exactly the same thing. The only problem is that my method is pretty much free, while the Astrogranite costs $7.80 per pot, so do keep that in mind. Now, once I let that texturing dry, the next thing I need to do, of course, is to prime my miniatures. I use a can of flat white primer from Rust-Oleum. Bought this at my local Walmart for $3.99, and I just gave it the once over. If you want to do exactly the same thing from Games Workshop, you need to use Corax White Spray, which costs you $17. Now, the reason why you do priming is because of two reasons. The first reason why is because priming actually gives a really solid surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. Unfortunately, if you were to take your acrylic paints and to apply it on just a flat plastic on the miniature without any priming, any slight friction would cause that paint to rub off the miniature and ruin the overall finish on your paint job. So priming prevents that from happening. The second impact that priming has is that it basically creates a base coat that your colors will work off of. Traditionally speaking, the lighter the primer you use is more vibrancy of the colors, while the darker the primer that you use is more muted the colors. And because we're doing a quick paint method on this kill team, the colors will be muted down quite substantially by using the oil wash. So I want to go for a bright and vibrant paint job, so that way when I apply the oil wash, it will not dull my colors down too badly. So because of that, I use a white primer in order to do that. So once we're done with our assembly, texturing, as well as priming, next thing we do now is start working on our base coats. So the very first base coat we actually use is Folk Art. We actually use a color called True Navy is what we actually use that color for. So, sorry, not True Navy, it's called True Blue. Costs 75 cents. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby or Walmart for about 75 cents. And we just do the once over on pretty much the entirety of the uniforms on these Navy Breachers. The nice thing about this kill team is that it's a military unit. So everybody pretty much is in uniform, so you get to use the same kind of color, so you can get through these guys really, really quick. The True Blue from Folk Art is a beautiful, bright, vibrant blue. It's not too light, it's not too dark, it's just perfect for what you needed to do. And just put two thin coats on this all over your miniatures as well. Now, if you wanted to use the Citadel equivalent, you have to use McCrag Blue, which costs you $4.55, as opposed to 75 cents. Then do exactly the same thing. So once you're done doing your two base coats, we got to move on to our next color. So now that we got the uniforms pretty much painted up, what we need to do now is start working on the finer details on these uniforms. Now the uniforms, especially on the smocks that these guys are wearing, have this wonderful edging and piping that goes along the perimeter of their jackets, as well as some of their vests as well. For this color, in order to pick that detail out, I decided to use Folk Art's Dutch Aqua. It costs 75 cents at my local Walmart, and I just put two thin layers on the actual piping on the jackets. As you can see here, it makes a beautiful contrast against that True Blue that we saw earlier. Now if you wanted to use the same exact product from Citadel, you have to use Athermatic Blue, which costs you $7.80 there. And that was the color you'll need to use from Citadel to do that. But I highly suggest the Dutch Aqua. After all, it's a fraction of the cost and does exactly the same thing. From there, the next base coat you work on is all the black that you see in this picture. That's primarily the shotguns that these guys are wearing, as well as the auction tanks that they actually have in the back of their armor, as well as their gloves, as well as the little suction cups that they actually have attached to their jumpsuits to their boots. I guess you would call those pressure seals, is actually what you would call those. Now for that color, I use Apple Barrel's Pavement Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. Pavement Paint is a wonderful color. It is actually extremely dark gray. Almost black. The only reason why it's not pure black is because there's a little bit of sediment inside the paint itself, giving that kind of gritty texture. And I love using this color because when you do dry brushing, it does a really awesome job of catching those highlights when it comes to dry brushing. So I highly recommend using pavement paint to do this. I just put this on 2 thin coats on their shotguns, their gauntlets, their boots, as well as the auction tanks that they have on their back, as well as some of the weapons that they're carrying as well. Now, if you wanted to use exactly the same kind of color from Games Workshop, you will need to buy what's called Eshin Gray, which costs you $4.55. Once again, 50 cents versus $4.55. The price saving basically justifies itself from the end result, as you're seeing here. Now, the last thing we're going to do real quick, of course, is to dry brush the entirety of the miniatures that we've painted so far. And to do this, I decided to use a color by Nita's Acrylic. It's called Slate Blue. It costs 65 cents at my local Hobby Lobby. And I just do a quick dry brushing all over the miniature, over the True Blue, the Dutch Aqua, as well as the pavement that we've actually applied to these miniatures as well. And like I said before, you can see exactly how that pavement is actually catching that highlighting color from the Slate Blue, and does a beautiful job of actually bringing out those details. Now, dry brushing is actually a very advanced technique to use in miniatures painting, and it does a couple of things. The first thing that dry brushing does is it creates the illusion of depth in your miniature. What it does is that the actual pigments of the paint actually catches upon the raised surfaces of the miniature itself while leaving the darker color in the recesses. That way you get that highlight. So you can see that the folds of the fabric, for example, the actual texturing on the weapons, the little rivets that make up the hose that they're wearing on their auction tanks, all those little details that we couldn't see previously is now being picked out by that slate blue and creates this beautiful effect. Now, if you also notice as well, we do have a little bit of a chalky kind of pastel finish on these miniatures by doing dry brushing. That's just a side effect of doing brushing. There's just nothing you can do about it for the most part. But not to worry, when we actually do our oil wash, that textured chalky look is going to go away because it's going to smooth out our transitions and blend our colors together as well. And as weird as it may sound, we actually have a majority of these miniatures actually painted up. All we got to really do now is focus on the finer details as well as metallic elements. So we're going to take a break real quick from the rest of the actual miniatures here. What we're actually going to do instead now is focus now upon the actual little sub details that are spread throughout the entirety of this kill team. First one being the servo skull. The other one being, of course, I believe that guy's called a breacher is what he's called, a door breacher, which is the guy on the right hand side. Now the guy on the right hand side actually does not have a helmet. He actually has a bare head being exposed to the elements. So in order to create that skin tone, I decided to pick that out in 2 thin layers of nutmeg brown. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And the servo skull that we have right next to him, we use Apple Barrel's Light Mocha, put 2 thin coats of that as well on the skull. It is a nice bone color. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents as well. Now, if you wanted to get the Games Workshop versions of these paints, you have to get Bugman's Glow from Nutmeg Brown, which costs $4.55. And as for the actual, for the Light Mocha, you have to use Bane Brain Brown, which costs $4.55 for that one as well. Now, as you can see there, $1 versus what, almost $9. You can see where the price justification comes in for using the cheaper products. And of course, we got to do a dry brush real quick. So for the servo skull, I use Apple Barrel's Ivory, which cost me 50 cents at my local Walmart, as opposed to Longbeard Gray, which costs $4.55 from Citadel. Just a quick dry brush on there to catch the details of the servo skull. And as for the guy's flesh that's exposed from his helmet, I decided to pick that out with a dry brushing of flesh. Apple Barrel paint costs 50 cents, as opposed to Cadian flesh tone, which costs us $4.55 at Games Workshop. And once you get done with that dry brushing, we can start working on the actual servo skull, as well as a little drone that they have in this kill team. So like I mentioned before, they do have a little bit of a drone that's located with this kill team, as well as a servo skull. The first thing we do, of course, is we paint the metallic elements on this little unit of drones real quick. So for the drone on the left-hand side, I painted the entire thing in Folk Arts gunmetal gray. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. The equivalent to this from Games Workshop would be Lead Belcher, which costs $7.80, which is almost 10 times as much, but it's exactly the same thing. I also use the same gunmetal gray for the metal piping and hubcap that's holding up the servo skull miniature on the right hand side. At the same time, I also picked out the little lens on the little drone there on the left hand side, as well as some of the wiring on the servo skull on the right hand side using King Gold from Apple Barrel Paint. That costs you about 50 cents at your local Walmart, as opposed to Averland Sunset from Citadel Paints, which costs us $4.55. So continuing on with the finer details on both the drone as well as the servo skull, first thing I use is Anita's Acrylics True Red, which costs 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. Use that to pick out some of the cabling that's on these guys. The equivalent to this for Games Workshop would be Mephiston Red, which costs $4.55. And I also use Apple Barrel's Holly Branch for some of the green wiring on the servo skull as well. That one costs 50 cents at your local Walmart. The equivalent color from Citadel would be Caliban Green, which is $4.55. So as you can see, we're saving pennies on the dollar in terms of the savings that we have on this. And once we actually pick out those wires and those details, the last thing we need to do now is pick out the tracks on the little drone on the left-hand side. So once again, for the drone on the left-hand side, I picked that out in 2 thin layers of payment paint for the tracks on both sides of it. This stuff costs 50 cents at my local Walmart as opposed to $4.55 for a pot of Eshin Gray. Just did 2 thin coats of the payment paint on that, and we're completely done with it. So now that we're done taking out those tracks on the little drone, next thing we need to do now is work on the other metallic elements on these 2 robots. So the next step was to work on the finer metallic elements on these miniatures as well. For the drone on the left-hand side, I picked out things like the Navy breachers, insignia, as well as some of the antennae coming out of the back of it. Same thing with the drone on the right hand side for the servo skull. I picked out some of the elements that, like, for example, like lenses, for example, of antennae as well. And for those colors, I use Aged Copper, which is made by Anita's Acrylic, which runs you about 65 cents. The equivalent to this would be Games Workshop's Brass Scorpion, which is $7.80, which is more than 10 times the price of the paint that I use. I also use Deco Art's Emperor Gold as well to pick out the gold elements, and that's also made by Deco Art as well. And that one costs 75 cents at my local Walmart, as opposed to Retributor Armor, which is $7.80 from Citadel, which is 10 times the cost as well. And the last thing I did real quick is I just did a quick dry brush on all the metallic elements of both miniatures. For that, I used Folk Art's Anniversary Silver. It cost me 75 cents at my local Walmart. Does a beautiful job of getting this kind of weathered, kind of highlighted look and lustrous look to some of the metallic elements. You would need to use Games Workshop's Ironbreaker from Citadel Paint. That's cost 10 times more at $7.80 to achieve the exact same effect. And now that we're done talking about these 2 drones, the next thing we need to do now is start going back to our main body of our kill team. So as you can see here for our main body of our kill team, most of the elements are already taken care of for the most part with the colors, and now we're going to really focus on the metallic elements. And as you can see, we have this beautiful bronzy kind of antique diving suit type of armor that the Imperial breachers actually wear. It kind of reminds me of something like the Big Daddies wear from the video game Bioshock. So to achieve that effect, what we decided to use is 2 thin layers of Anita's Aged Copper that we used, anti-copper, which we used earlier when we talked about the drones. That stuff costs about 65 cents at your local Walmart or Hobby Lobby, as opposed to Brass Scorpion, which is $7.80, which is 10 times as much. As you can see, we picked out the elements of the helmets as well as the chest rigs, also their arm greaves, as well as their magnetic boots that they're also wearing as well. At the same time, we also picked out some finer elements using copper by Folk Art as well. Now the Folk Art copper costs 75 cents at your local Walmart. You would need to use the Citadel equivalent, which is Screaming Bell, which costs $7.80, which is more than 10 times the cost of my Folk Art. It does exactly the same thing. For that copper color, what I decided to do is pick out the visors on their helmets, and as you can see, I left their white face masks white. The nice thing about that, because I used white primer for that, I didn't actually add any white paint to their face masks. I just left the primer there as it originally was because it was doing exactly what I needed to do. I was just really careful with when I applied the copper paint. But if you should make a mistake though, you could use light gray by Folk Art or any kind of light gray paint, and that could use that to touch it up if you need to. And once we're done adding our metallic elements, now it's time for us to focus on some of the finer details. Now the nice thing about these kill team miniatures is that they do have a lot of character and a lot of interesting little tidbits on these miniatures and these little interesting details that make them really stand out. Makes them really perfect for skirmish type games because they have so much character involved. For example, these 3 fighters here, which is the leader of the unit, as well as the guy carrying the plasma gun, as well as the bombardier guy who's got that flak vest with the grenades on. Now for the plasma weapon, what I decided to put is 2 thin coats of Apple Barrel's Winter Green on the plasma coil there. That costs 50 cents at my local Walmart. The equivalent to that, Citadel will be Gauss Blaster Green, which is $4.55, which is about 10 times as much. Just put 2 thin coats of that Winter Green on that plasma coil to give a nice kind of eerie glowing look on that weapon. And then for the other 2 guys, which is the Commander as well as for the demolitions expert, I decided to pick out the frag grenades that these guys are carrying as well. I picked it out in 2 thin layers of Holly Branch, cost 50 cents at my local Walmart. The corresponding color from Games Workshop Citadel line would be Caliban Green, which is $4.55 for that, almost 10 times as much. I just put 2 thin layers on those to pick out those little individual details, and we go back to the rest of the kill team. Now the next detail I decided to focus on was actually on dry brushing the copper as well as aged copper type of metallic elements that we had going on in this kill team, kind of give it like a lustrous, kind of weathered look. So because I just did a quick dry brush with Folk Arts Anniversary Silver, cost me 75 cents on my local Walmart. The Citadel equivalent would be Ironbreaker, which costs more than 10 times as much, which is $7.80, but both products do exactly the same thing. As you can see, I applied this all over the aged copper armor that these guys are wearing as well. So we have this kind of like shiny, glistening, kind of polished look going on with the armor, and it looks really, really nice. It's very subtle and also brings out a lot of those details. For example, the breacher there who's got the shield, you can actually see the emblem of the actual and the rivets of that shield and how it's kind of basically protecting them. Looks very, very gargantuan as well as very baroque in the terms of bringing out those details, which looks absolutely fantastic. And the very last metallic elements that we focus on, of course, are for the weapons themselves. So the barrels of the guns, for example, the blades of the weapons that they're carrying for their boarding axes, some of the other metallic elements, we picked that out in gunmetal gray. At the same time, we also did things like pick out belt buckles as well as the emblems on the chests of their armor in both Deco Arts, Emperor's Gold, as well as gunmetal gray. Just finishing up those very last details, things like the actual rivets as well as the piping and valves on the piping that's based on their backpacks, for example. All those things, of course, both cost 75 cents at your local Walmart. The equivalents, of course, would be Lead Belcher as well as Retributor armor, which is about 10 times as more than the actual 75 cents at $7.80 a piece in order to create the exact same effect. So with most of the metallic elements done, what we gotta do now is start focusing on some of the finer details on these miniatures. For example, we have typical crew members who are actually carrying their combat shotguns on the small of their back, as you can see here in this photo, for example. They actually have these really cool looking holsters that they use to attach their shotguns to the small of their backs. So to pick out those straps, I actually used 2 coats of Territorial Beige, which is made by Apple Paint, cost 50 cents at my local Walmart. The corresponding Citadel color would be Baylor Brown, which costs $4.55, almost 10 times as much, in order to create the exact same effect that you see here. So once we get done with that detail, we can move on to our next one. And the very last detail that we focus on for all of these fighters are the little pipes as well as hose that they have attaching their gauntlets to their suits. So these guys actually have a bunch of little tubes running from their gauntlets, for example, directly into their jumpsuits. They also have a couple of guys running from their legs up to their arms, from their boots up to their thighs as well. So for those little details, we just picked that out in 2 thin layers of Anita's Acrylic True Red. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. Like I said before, the equivalent to this would be Mephiston Red from Citadel, which costs us $4.55 for that. And once we're done with that, we are pretty much done with these miniatures and we can start working on the bases. So on the bases on these ones, I just put a single coat of pavement paint directly on the bases. And I actually watered down the pavement paint just a little bit so that way it'd be easier to spread along all the texturing. Now you might be thinking, Commander Cheapskate, by doing that though, you can see a lot of the white texturing popping up underneath. And that is perfectly fine. And the reason why is because we're going to dry brush these bases anyway, so that white that's peeking through the undercoat, it's just going to add to that overall dry brushing effect. It's just easier just to water down the pavement paint to get to all the nooks and crannies real quick, and then do a real quick dry brush to get a really nice final finish. And once again, when we dry brush our bases, we're going to use Folk Arts Pale Gray, which costs 75 cents at your local Walmart. The Citadel equivalent to this would be, I believe, Ulthuan Gray, which costs us $4.55 instead. We just do a quick general dry brush with that pale gray all over the bases. And as you can see, it does a beautiful job of capturing those textures that we put on before. And as you can see, the white undercoat that was showing through the original coat of pavement paint is not really showing up anymore. The reason why is because we did that Folk Art dry brushing. So now that we're done dry brushing and painting up our bases, the next step, and probably the most important step, is an oil wash. So we are using a quick paint method for this kill team, and to do that we do a single wash, which is known as an oil wash. Now when it comes to this step, a lot of painters like to use Army Painter Strong Tone, made by Army Painter. It costs $32 a can. It does exactly what it does as advertised. It actually washes directly into the miniature, creates this beautiful kind of details that we didn't see before. Also protects your miniatures with a polyurethane finish as well. Now, Army Painter Strong Tone does exactly what it advertises. It's a wonderful product, but it's really expensive at $32 a can. What I like to use instead is the Midwax Polyshade Acrylics in Mission Oak color, which costs $6.99 at my local Walmart. The reason why I like using that color is because it does exactly the same thing as Army Painter Strong Tone, except it's a lot cheaper, about 5 times less than what you could actually have to pay for this if you got it from Army Painter to do exactly the same thing. Now what the oil washing does is a couple of things. The first thing that the oil washing does is that darker color now seeps into the recesses of the miniatures and brings out a lot of those details we couldn't see before. For example, we could actually see now the individual folds of the fabric, the bending of the fabric, how it gathers at the joints. Also brings out the rivets as well as the metallic work on the armor, the texturing of the grenades and of the weapons as well. If you look at that shield in the middle of the table, it brings out a lot of those carved in details, embossed details that we couldn't see earlier with just normal painting as well. And that's the reason why oil washing is so important, because it brings out a lot of those details that you couldn't see. Another thing that the oil washing does as well is it smooths out the transitions between our dry brushing as well as our base coating. As you can see here, the actual that kind of pastel chalky finish that we saw earlier is now completely gone, because now it's blended our base coats and our dry brushing and makes it look a lot more organic, and also makes it look a lot more professional as well. And the last thing that the oil wash actually does too is it also mutes down the vibrancy of the colors that we used. As you can see, these miniatures are not as Technicolor bright as they used to be, and that's the reason why I used such bright colors at the beginning, is because I knew that the oil washing stage was going to mute those colors down. And as you can see, there's more of like a more believable kind of color scale that we're seeing here as well. Now, like I said before, the Mission Oak and the Minwax Polyshade does contain polyurethane, which is going to give a kind of like a clear coat hardening surface that was going to protect your miniatures, which is going to be absolutely fantastic. But to make that happen, you do have to let these dry and cure for at least 24 hours. In my opinion, the best time to do an oil washing is make it the very last step of your painting session, and then pick it up whenever you come back to the project later, and by that point it should be dry and ready to go. For example, I like to paint in the evening, so I make this the very last step that I use. I go to work in the morning, spend all day going back to work, and when I come back in the evening to paint my miniatures, usually it's dried and ready to go. And that's exactly what you need to do for your oil washing. Now, once we get done with our polyurethane, our Mission Oak color basically drying up, the next thing we do, of course, is a spray varnish. Now, this next spray varnish is optional. You don't necessarily need to do this if you don't want to. For me, though, I like to do this, and the reason why is because when the miniature actually dries, that polyurethane has a very high gloss, very reflective finish, and I don't care for that too much. I like more of a matte finish for my miniatures. So in order to fix that problem, what I do is I give it a quick spray with some Krylon matte varnish spray that I get from my local Walmart for $5.99. If you want to do exactly the same thing, the Citadel version would be Munitorium varnish, which costs $19.50, which is almost 4 times as much as the Krylon matte varnish instead. I just do a really quick once over. As you can see, it mutes down that the sheen of the actual of the polyurethane coating, makes it look more believable. And the last thing I do, of course, is I rim the bases. I do that in 2 thin coats of Folk Art Skyline, cost 75 cents at my local Hobby Lobby. This stuff is amazing because what it does is like a nice grayish blue kind of color, and I use the same color for all the bases that I use for all of our Nick Arena miniatures in the studio's collection. Now, the equivalent color to this would be from Games Workshop, which is called Rust Gray, is what it's called. It costs $4.55 in order to do exactly the same thing, but at a fraction of the cost. And once again, here is the end result in all of its glory. As you can see, we have a beautiful tabletop finish on this kill team with these Imperial Navy breachers. They look absolutely fantastic, and we also saved a ton of money of actually doing it. So now that we're done talking about exactly how we go about painting these miniatures, let's go and talk about exactly what materials that you will need to purchase from Games Workshop Citadel as well as Army Painter to achieve the exact same result as we did on their miniatures. Now, this is what I like to call the Army Painter Citadel shopping list, and these are the materials you need to buy from those 2 companies if you want to paint your miniatures exactly the same way we did, and this is the price you would have to pay for that. Now, you have to buy a can of Corax White Spray, which costs $17, as well as the following colors: Baneblade Brown, Averland Sunset, Longbeard Gray, Caliban Green, Bugman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone, Baylor Brown, Gauss Blaster Green, Eshin Gray, Fenrisian Gray, Mephiston Red. All those cost $4.55 per pot in order to get those equivalent colors that we use from Apple Barrel as well as from other companies that we use as well. Now, you'll also need to use metallic paints of Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher, Screaming Bill, as well as Ironbreaker. Those all cost $7.80 a piece. For your gray colors, you need to use Rust Gray as well as Ulthuan Gray, which run $4.55 for those colors. If you wanted to use the same blues that we did, you have to buy a pot of Aethermatic Blue, which costs $7.80, as well as Macragge Blue, which costs $4.55 for that. And rounding out your metallic paints, you'll need to buy a pot of Retributor Armor, which costs $7.80 for that. Now, to do the oil washing, you will need to buy Army Painter Strong Tone, which costs $32 per can. And if you wanted to do the same kind of matte finish for our miniatures, you need to buy a can of Munitorium Varnish, which costs $19.50. And the very last thing you need to purchase, of course, if you wanted to use the texture paints from Games Workshop Citadel, you need to buy Astro Granite, which is a cost $7.80 per pot. Now, assuming that you're purchasing all those materials for the very first time in order to paint up this kill team, you're talking about a grand total investment of $186.80 that you'll need to spend to buy the products from Citadel as well as Army Painter to paint up your kill team exactly the same way we did. Now, when you look at that as opposed to my Cheapskate method, which costs us only $29.42, you're talking about a grand total savings of $157.38 to do exactly the same thing we did, but with much cheaper paints instead. So if you're looking for a way of saving some money on your miniatures wargaming hobby, I suggest taking the Cheapskate method for your painting, and it's going to do exactly the same thing as the name brand stuff at only a fraction of the cost. So in conclusion, there you go. This is what exactly how you can save a bunch of money painting up your Imperial Navy breachers for Warhammer 40,000 Kill Team. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blog.com for all the greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this video, you guys. We will see you guys in the next one. Peace out and stay classy.